The new Arctic Cold War when ice melts. War forms a new Cold War, the new Silk Road. Part 1. Melting Lines. The ice did not disappear all at once. It thinned first, cracked quietly, retreated kilometer by kilometer, season by season, until what had once been a frozen barrier became a corridor. By the late 2000s, satellite images told a story no government could ignore. The Arctic was opening. Not symbolically, not hypothetically, physically. For the first time in recorded history, large commercial vessels could cross the top of the world for most of the year. The route shaved weeks off journeys between Asia and Europe. Fuel costs dropped, insurance models changed. Entire supply chains were rewritten. The media called it a miracle of climate adaptation. Naval strategists called it something else, a vulnerability, a new Silk Road. The shipping industry moved faster than diplomacy. Container vessels flagged in Europe and Asia began transiting the Arctic sea route with increasing frequency. Their hulls were reinforced, their crews trained for extreme conditions, their routes carefully coordinated with ice monitoring centers. What they did not have, at least not at first, was protection. The Arctic had never needed it. For decades, the region had been governed by assumption rather than enforcement. Treaties existed, but they were vague. Claims overlapped. Jurisdictions blurred beneath ice and snow. Now the ice was gone, and with it, the illusion that the Arctic belonged to no one. The escorts appear. The first military escorts were described as precautionary. Icebreakers with national insignia, support vessels monitoring safety, naval patrols conducting routine presence operations. No one used the word militarization, but ships noticed. Asian container vessels traveling westward began sailing with armed escorts through certain stretches. European energy tankers did the same. Communications protocols multiplied. Navigation warnings became more frequent. Each escort was justified. Each escort raised the stakes, the unwritten rules. There were no clearly defined lanes, no universally enforced maritime corridors. The Arctic Sea Route cut through areas claimed by multiple states, some recognized internationally, others asserted unilaterally. Control was less about law and more about proximity, and proximity favored those already there. Naval bases once considered remote outposts suddenly became frontline infrastructure. Airfields built for emergencies became strategic assets. Satellites once tasked with climate monitoring were repurposed for tracking hulls and wakes. The Arctic was warming. The geopolitical temperature was rising faster. The European vessel, the Aurora Meridian, was not a military ship. It is a European-flagged commercial vessel carrying high-value electronics and industrial components from East Asia to Northern Europe. Its route through the Arctic cut nearly 2 weeks off its traditional journey. The ship complied with all known regulations, filed its transit notices, maintained open communications. Its captain had made the crossing twice before. On the third voyage, everything changed. First contact. It happened just after dawn. The Arctic sky was pale, almost colorless. The sea was calm, unnaturally so, broken only by slow-moving ice fragments drifting like debris from a forgotten world. The radar picked up the contact first. Unidentified, fast-moving craft approaching from the northeast. The Aurora Meridian's crew followed protocol. They broadcast their identity, route, and intent. They altered speed slightly, signaling cooperation. The reply did not come through civilian channels. It came encrypted, then visual. Gray hulls, unmarked at first, then closer. Russian marine vessels, The confrontation. The Russian ships maneuvered aggressively, close enough to force course correction. Loudspeakers ordered the Aurora Meridian to halt for inspection. The captain protested. This was an international route. The ship was compliant. There had been no prior notice. The response was immediate. A warning shot, fired into the water but close enough to send a clear message. The ship slowed. Armed Marines boarded. Conflicting narratives. What happened next would be debated for months. Russian authorities later claimed the vessel had violated safety protocols and entered a restricted zone. They cited environmental risk, navigation errors, security concerns. The ship's crew told a different story. They were detained. Communications were restricted. Cargo manifests were examined with unusual interest. No contraband was found. After hours of inspection, the Marines withdrew. The Aurora Meridian was allowed to continue. But the message had already been delivered. The call for help. Within hours, European maritime authorities alerted Allied governments. The incident was framed carefully at first. Harassment. Interference. Unsafe conduct. No one said attack. But internally, the assessment was blunt. This was a test, and it would not be the last. NATO enters the picture. The request for assistance was phrased as reassurance, not escalation. Increased presence, monitoring operations, escort coordination. NATO naval assets were redeployed northward under existing mandates. Official statements emphasized safety and freedom of navigation. Russian statements responded in kind. Calm, measured, dismissive. "We are ensuring order in our region," one spokesperson said. Others are overreacting. Behind the scenes, military planners saw something else entirely. Lines were being drawn, not in maps, but on water. Markets react. Shipping insurers adjusted premiums overnight. Commodity traders watched carefully. Energy markets wavered. The Arctic route was still faster, still cheaper, but now it came with risk. And risk had geopolitical weight. Diplomats' scramble emergency consultations were convened. European capitals demanded explanations. Asian trade ministries sought assurances. Neutral states asked questions no one wanted to answer. Who controlled the Arctic? Who enforced the rules? And what happened if those rules changed mid-voyage? Publicly, negotiations were calm. Privately, the language hardened. The question no one asked aloud. Was this the beginning of a new Cold War? No one wanted to say it. The phrase carried history, consequences, escalation. And yet, the elements were all there. Strategic geography, economic leverage, military signaling without declaration. The paradox was impossible to ignore. As the planet warmed, the world was freezing into blocks. The ice had receded far enough to reveal opportunity. It had also revealed fault lines no one could refreeze. And somewhere between commerce and confrontation, the Arctic had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Now we continue with part 2, where the confrontation escalates, narratives collide, and the world realizes the Arctic is no longer neutral. Part 2. The incident. The official reports were written in careful language. Unscheduled boarding. Safety inspection. Temporary communication disruption. But no one who read them seriously believed that was all it had been. Within hours of the Aurora Meridian resuming its journey, copies of the ship's captain's private log reached European maritime authorities. The tone was restrained, professional, and unmistakably alarmed. Russian naval units maneuvered in a manner inconsistent with standard maritime safety practices. Crew felt coerced. Inspection exceeded environmental compliance. The final line was the one that mattered. The intent appeared strategic. The first briefings in Brussels, the emergency briefing room filled quickly. Naval attachés, legal advisors, energy and trade officials. The incident was projected onto screens from multiple angles. Radar tracks, satellite imagery, crew testimony, intercepted radio traffic. No one spoke for several minutes. Then a senior diplomat broke the silence. "This wasn't enforcement," she said. "It was signaling." Heads nodded. The Arctic had been used as a message board, Moscow's position. The response from Moscow arrived swiftly and predictably. A spokesperson addressed the press with calm authority. "The vessel entered a zone subject to special safety regulations," he said. "Our forces acted responsibly to prevent environmental harm." Questions followed. Why were the regulations not published? Why was force used? Why now? The spokesperson smiled. "The Arctic is changing," he said. "Some parties are slow to adapt." Competing maps. In military planning rooms across Europe and North America, analysts overlaid maps, official maritime boundaries, exclusive economic zones, unilateral claims. They did not align. The Arctic had always been ambiguous. That ambiguity had once been a buffer. Now it was an accelerant. As the ice retreated, so did deniability. The second ship 3 days later, a different vessel reported interference. An Asian-flagged bulk carrier, smaller, less politically visible, experienced electronic navigation disruptions while transiting the same corridor. Its crew did not see naval vessels. They didn't need to. GPS signals flickered. Course data jumped. Autopilot disengaged. The ship slowed and drifted until manual control was restored. No damage, no boarding, no official complaint, just uncertainty. The pattern emerges. Taken alone, each incident could be dismissed. Together they formed a pattern. Selective pressure, calculated ambiguity, enough force to intimidate, not enough to provoke immediate retaliation. This was not naval warfare. It was boundary testing. NATO's dilemma. NATO's response was constrained by its own success. The alliance was built for deterrence, not policing gray zones where no shots were fired and no territory was formally invaded. Military planners proposed options: increased patrols, joint exercises, permanent Arctic task groups. Diplomats countered with caution: escalation risk, alliance unity, economic exposure. Every move carried cost. Doing nothing carried more. The escorts become permanent. Within weeks, the language shifted. What had been temporary escorts became standing maritime security arrangements. European and Asian commercial vessels transiting the Arctic were now routinely accompanied by armed naval ships, sometimes at a distance, sometimes visibly close. The sea lanes filled with steel. This was the paradox in motion. Trade expanded. So did the military presence meant to protect it. Civilian crews, military shadows. Captains adjusted. Routes were filed with greater secrecy. Transponders remained on at all times. Emergency protocols were rewritten. Crews were trained to expect interception. Insurance premiums climbed. Shipping companies weighed cost against speed and still chose the Arctic. The savings were too large. The risk was now priced in. Back-channel diplomacy. Behind closed doors, diplomats worked furiously. European envoys met Russian counterparts in neutral cities. Asian trade officials pressed for guarantees. Military attachés exchanged carefully worded reassurances. Everyone agreed on one thing publicly: no one wants conflict. Privately, No one trusted that statement anymore. The strategic calculation. In Moscow, the Arctic was framed as a matter of sovereignty, historic presence, geographic proximity, security necessity. In Europe, it was framed as international access, freedom of navigation, global trade, shared governance. Both arguments had legal merit. Neither resolved the core issue: control. The leak. The turning point came not from a battlefield, but from a server. A confidential briefing document, circulated among defense planners, leaked to the press. It outlined potential escalation scenarios in the Arctic. None involved formal war. All involved miscalculation. The headline was blunt: Arctic trade route could trigger global crisis. Markets reacted instantly. Public awareness. For the first time, the Arctic entered public consciousness not as a climate symbol, but as a strategic flashpoint. Talk shows debated it. Experts argued over maps. Old Cold War language resurfaced. Spheres of influence. Deterrence. Containment. The phrase New Cold War appeared more frequently, always with quotation marks. The Russian exercise. 2 weeks later, Russia announced a previously scheduled naval exercise in the Arctic. Missile-capable ships, submarines, air patrols. The announcement emphasized transparency. The message did not. NATO forces mirrored the movement, carefully, defensively, but unmistakably. The Arctic had become crowded. The question of intent intelligence agencies struggled with the same question. Was this deliberate escalation or strategic opportunism? The answer mattered, because one justified restraint, the other demanded response. The European decision. After another emergency meeting, European leaders agreed on a unified position: no recognition of unilateral control, continued commercial transit, permanent multinational naval presence. The announcement was measured. The implication was not. The incident with the Aurora Meridian had not started a war, but it had ended an era. The Arctic was no longer a blank space on the map. It was a corridor. And every corridor, once opened, demands a gatekeeper. We continue now with Part 3, where infrastructure, law, and proxy control turn the Arctic into a chessboard, and where the conflict hardens without open war. Part 3, claims without war. War did not arrive with explosions. It arrived with paperwork. As the Arctic route normalized under armed escort, governments shifted from reaction to consolidation. The question was no longer whether the route would exist. It clearly would. But who would define its rules? And rules, unlike ice, do not melt. They harden. The infrastructure race. The first visible shift came through construction. Ports once designed for research vessels expanded quietly. Ice-capable docks multiplied along remote coastlines. Airstrips lengthened. Storage facilities appeared where there had once been only tundra and weather stations. The infrastructure race accelerated beneath the language of cooperation. Each new port extension was justified as support for search and rescue. Each expanded airstrip was framed as humanitarian readiness. Each satellite launch was described as environmental monitoring. But when analysts overlaid timelines, a different picture emerged. The projects clustered around choke points. Narrow passages where ice still lingered. Straits where vessels had no alternative routes. Control didn't require ownership of the entire Arctic. Only of the places ships could not avoid. Law as a weapon legal teams replaced admirals as the most influential actors. Governments submitted overlapping claims to international bodies, each framed as technical clarifications rather than territorial grabs. Footnotes became battlegrounds. Definitions of internal waters, transit passage, and environmental jurisdiction were stretched until they nearly tore. No one rejected international law outright. They simply interpreted it differently. A corridor described by one side as a regulated national route was labeled by another as an international strait. The difference was subtle and absolute. One allowed enforcement, the other forbade it. Every document took months to process. Every delay favored whoever already had ships in the water. Research stations that watched. New research stations appeared along the Arctic Rim, funded generously and built quickly. They were staffed by scientists, engineers, and logistics crews. Their stated mission was climate monitoring. They monitored plenty: ice thickness, shipping density, radio traffic, orbital passes. Their data feeds were shared widely. With ministries of defense, no one accused them of spying. No one needed to. The private sector joins in energy companies followed next. As ice retreated, previously unreachable seabeds became viable targets. Seismic surveys resumed. Test drilling was announced, then postponed, then quietly resumed again. Each permit was legal. Each license was contested. Security contractors appeared on board survey ships, officially unarmed, officially civilian. The Arctic was becoming expensive, and anything expensive attracts protection. Proxy pressure? Pressure intensified without a single declaration. Ports denied refueling due to safety reviews. Maintenance crews were delayed by inspections. Insurance coverage was withdrawn with little explanation. No one could prove coordination. Everyone felt its effect. Asian shipping firms rerouted temporarily. European companies negotiated exemptions. Smaller operators simply disappeared from the route, priced out by uncertainty. The Arctic corridor narrowed, not physically, but economically. The near miss, the incident that nearly changed everything, happened without headlines. A European escort vessel and a Russian patrol crossed paths in fog so dense radar returns overlapped. Both altered course, late. Hulls passed within meters. No collision, no shots fired. But audio recordings later revealed raised voices, overlapping commands, and one phrase that appeared in multiple intelligence briefings afterward: maintain position. The phrase meant different things to different sides. Markets feel the chill commodity prices reacted first, then insurance markets, then shipping futures. The Arctic route was still faster, but volatility erased its advantage. Investors demanded clarity. They did not get it. Instead, they got statements, carefully worded, reassuring, non-committal, the kind of language that signaled no one was in control. Public calm, private alarm. Publicly, leaders emphasized restraint. Privately, contingency plans multiplied. Naval commanders were given broader discretion. Rules of engagement were rewritten with conditional clauses. Cyber units were tasked with monitoring maritime systems for resilience. Everyone insisted they were preparing defensively. History suggested otherwise. The Arctic as a system. Analysts began describing the Arctic not as a region, but as a system. Trade, energy, security, law. Disrupt one element and the others reacted. The paradox deepened. The route that promised cooperation through shared benefit was producing division through shared risk. No borders had moved. No flags had been raised. And yet, the Arctic was no longer neutral. It had become a space where power was exercised without being named, and where the absence of war required more discipline than war ever had. End of Part 3. We continue with Part 4, where the undeclared conflict hardens into a true Cold War dynamic, fought through sabotage, cyber pressure, deniability, and one incident that nearly tips the system into open confrontation. Part 4. The Cold War Nobody Declared. No declaration was ever made. There were no speech, no red line announced to the world. No single moment anyone could point to and say, this is where it began. Instead, the conflict seeped in quietly, through systems designed to fail silently. The first breakdown. It began with a malfunction. A European-flagged container vessel, escorted by Allied naval ships, reported a cascading failure in its navigation suite while transiting a narrow Arctic corridor. The failure was sudden, comprehensive, and oddly precise. GPS dropped first, then inertial backups, then satellite communications. The ship did not drift aimlessly. It slowed, gracefully, deliberately, until manual control was restored. No damage, no collision. But the logs told a story. The failure had not been random. Cyber shadows. Within hours, cybersecurity teams began analyzing the data. They found anomalies embedded deep within firmware, code that should never have been touched after manufacturing. The intrusion was subtle, elegant, and designed to leave doubt. No signature, no claim, no proof. Publicly, officials described the event as a technical issue under investigation. Privately, the assessment was blunt. This was a demonstration. Deniability as strategy. The brilliance of the act lay in what it avoided. No loss of life, no environmental spill, no visible aggression. Just enough disruption to remind everyone that control of the Arctic was no longer about ships alone. It was about systems. And systems were vulnerable everywhere. The response that wasn't allied governments considered retaliation. They debated cyber countermeasures, economic pressure, targeted sanctions. Each option was examined and deferred. Retaliation required attribution. Attribution required certainty. Certainty did not exist. And in that ambiguity, restraint became the only responsible choice. The paradox deepened. The second incident. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, a Russian research vessel operating near a contested zone reported a navigation anomaly of its own. Equipment failure, communication loss, temporary drift. The vessel recovered. Moscow issued a brief statement blaming environmental interference. No accusation was made. No explanation was offered. The message was unmistakable. The loop incidents multiplied. Minor, isolated, unprovable. Each one raised insurance costs. Each one tightened escort protocols. Each one increased the military footprint. Quietly. What had begun as protection were now deterrence. And deterrence, by its nature, assumes threat. The Arctic Command Center's new command centers appeared, not announced, but observable. Satellite imagery revealed expanded facilities. Undersea cable activity increased. Unmanned systems patrolled areas once left empty. No missiles were deployed. None were needed. The Arctic had become a surveillance environment. Every ship was tracked, every deviation logged, every anomaly analyzed. Diplomacy under pressure. Diplomats continued to meet. The language grew colder. Words like misunderstanding gave way to unacceptable risk. Concern became violation of norms. Dialogue became frameworks. The talks did not fail. They simply stopped producing progress. Each side accused the other of destabilization while insisting on its own restraint. Both were telling the truth. The media awakens. The press finally caught up. Investigative journalists pieced together timelines. Analysts spoke openly about gray zone conflict. Headlines used the phrase, "no leader would," A new Cold War in the Arctic. Officials denied it. The public did not believe them. The near collision. The moment that nearly ended the pretense came during a routine escort operation. A NATO escort vessel and a Russian patrol converged at a choke point where ice still constrained maneuverability. Visibility dropped. Communications overlapped. Orders were issued simultaneously. Both ships altered course. Too late. They missed each other by meters. Sonar logs later revealed something worse. A submarine, unidentified, had been beneath them. For a split second, 3 armed platforms occupied the same narrow volume of water. No one fired. But the incident crossed an internal threshold. Emergency channels. Emergency hotlines lit up. Military leaders spoke directly for the first time in months. The tone was controlled, but urgent. This cannot happen again. We agree. Then change your posture. So must you. The conversation went in circles. Everyone understood the problem. No one wanted to be the first to blink. The economic front. As military escalation stalled, economic pressure intensified. Port access tightened. Export controls expanded. Energy partnerships were quietly suspended. No embargoes were declared. But friction increased everywhere. Trade continued, slower, more expensive, under watch. The Arctic route remained open, but it was no longer free. The strategic realization behind closed doors, strategists reached the same conclusion independently. This conflict could not be won, not militarily, not economically, not legally. The Arctic was too interconnected, too exposed, too essential. Victory would mean collapse, the unspoken agreement. And so, without signing anything, a new order began to form. Incidents were contained. Escorts maintained distance. Cyber operations continued, but with invisible limits. A balance emerged, not of trust, but of caution. A Cold War without ideology, without walls, without speeches. The world had stepped back from the edge, not because it wanted peace, but because no one could afford the alternative. The Arctic remained open, but every ship that crossed it now carried the weight of an undeclared war. Now we continue with the final chapter, Part 5, bringing the story to a hybrid ending. Public reckoning, partial exposure, and an uneasy new world order that resolves nothing, yet changes everything. Part 5. The Paradox. The moment that forced the world to confront reality did not involve ships colliding or missiles launching. It began with data. The disclosure. An international shipping consortium, pressed by insurers, shareholders, and regulators, released an unprecedented report. Not a political document, not an accusation, a risk assessment. It detailed every incident over the past 18 months: boardings, electronic interference, escort confrontations, insurance withdrawals, unexplained delays. Each event was footnoted, time-stamped, cross-verified. The conclusion was cautious, almost timid. The Arctic sea route now presents systemic geopolitical risk incompatible with traditional assumptions of neutrality. The markets understood the sentence immediately. So did governments. Public reckoning news outlets seized on the report. Not because it named an aggressor, it didn't, but because it confirmed what everyone had sensed, and no one had been willing to say openly. The Arctic was no longer a passage, it was a pressure point. Talk shows debated sovereignty. Analysts dusted off Cold War vocabulary. Environmental activists accused governments of militarizing climate change itself. Leaders responded with familiar phrases. Dialogue, de-escalation, shared responsibility. The public heard something else. Fear. the emergency summit. Within weeks, a summit was convened in a neutral city. No flags outside, no joint photographs. Delegations arrived quietly. Military, diplomatic, economic. The Arctic states were joined by those who depended on the route, but had no territory there at all. The room was large. The trust inside it was not. What everyone knew behind closed doors, there were no illusions. Everyone acknowledged the same truths. The Arctic route was economically irresistible. It could not be controlled by one power without triggering collapse. Militarization had already gone too far to reverse. The question was no longer who owns the Arctic. It was how to survive it. The bargain nobody wanted. The agreement that emerged was imperfect by design. No borders were redrawn, no claims withdrawn, no apologies issued. Instead, a framework. Multinational escort coordination zones, shared incident investigation mechanisms, limits on military proximity to civilian shipping, voluntary, unenforceable but public. It was not a treaty. It was a truce written in margins. Russia's calculation Moscow accepted the framework without enthusiasm. Its public statements emphasized sovereignty and historical presence. Its private calculations were colder. The Arctic route remained open. Its infrastructure advantage remained real. Its influence remained disproportionate. Formal control was unnecessary. Access was leverage enough. NATO's adjustment for NATO. The outcome was sobering. Deterrence had worked, but at a cost. The alliance had been forced into permanent presence without clear authority, responsible for stability. It did not fully control. It adapted. Less visibility, more coordination, fewer symbols. The Cold War playbook was updated for a world where escalation traveled through spreadsheets and satellite feeds, not speeches. The Asian powers, the primary commercial beneficiaries of the route, emerged quieter, but sharper. They had learned a lesson older powers once knew well. Access without control is vulnerability. Investment shifted. Alternative routes were explored. Redundancies built. Dependence reduced, but not eliminated. The Arctic remained too valuable to abandon, too dangerous to trust. The Arctic itself, the ice continued to melt. That was the cruel constant. Each year the window widened. Each year the stakes grew. New seabeds were exposed. New resources mapped. New temptations surfaced. The paradox deepened. The more the world relied on the Arctic, the more unstable it became. No victory. There was no victory to declare. No power emerged dominant. No alliance secured control. No rule set went uncontested. The route functioned. Trade flowed. But every ship crossed under armed observation, tracked by satellites owned by rival states, insured by companies pricing in conflict, escorted by navies pretending they were not adversaries. Peace existed, but it was conditional. The new normal years later, analysts would look back and argue over when the new Cold War truly began. Some would point to the boarding of the Aurora Meridian, others to the first cyber incident, others still to the moment markets priced in Arctic risk. They would all be wrong. The Cold War did not begin with confrontation. It began with opportunity. The final paradox. The Arctic had offered the world a gift, a shorter route, cheaper trade, a shared future shaped by cooperation. What it revealed instead was something older, that when barriers fall, power rushes in. That climate change does not dissolve conflict, it relocates it. That the most dangerous wars are not fought over ideology, but over access. Closing as ships continued to pass through the thinning ice, Their wakes cut lines across waters once untouched by human ambition. Above them, satellites watched. Below them, submarines listened. And around them, nations agreed on one unspoken truth. The Arctic was open. And that openness had changed everything. This is the end. Our team loves it when you subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much for listening.